Hey everybody, welcome to Off the Lot. I'm Ken Kabatoff.
And I am Anthony Epp, and we are here to dive deep into the world of independent filmmaking and really get to the nuts and bolts of how to make your movies on your own terms.
With the Hollywood landscape changing so quickly, now is the time to become your own gatekeeper. And with this podcast, we'll explore exactly what that looks like. So be sure to like, follow, or subscribe. And if you like something that you hear, share it with your friends. It really helps us out. So let's dive in. Anthony, as we are recording this, the Sundance Film Festival has just started. We're a few days in. Obviously, I wish I was there. I'd love to go to Sundance. I think it'd be a really, really fun time. Maybe one day one of my movies can get in there. Or, if your movie gets in, we can go together. If you're,
Yeah,
I
there you
didn't
go.
want to just invite myself.
Listen, I'll need someone to help pay for the room anyway, so as many people as possible.
Yeah, I can imagine the room rates go up quite a bit for Sundance. There's an interesting vibe about Sundance this year from what I've been reading about, because 2024 was like a really, really strong year for indie film. And so the Oscar nominations have just come out as well, and The Substance got nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay. It's a really interesting thing for an indie movie to do that, and not only that, a genre indie movie, a horror movie to break through that ceiling at the Oscars. So in general, there's this really cool vibe about indie film out there right now, and it's sort of making a big comeback. And IndieWire was just writing about this Sundance market preview that highlights films like Thelma and The Substance, and the distributors like Magnolia and Mubi having achieved these like record results, taking risk on unconventional projects. The Sundance Film Festival this year is seeming like this hot spot for buyers that are seeking unique films with commercial potential, moving away from more cookie cutter formulas. So the more out there ideas are actually starting to perform very, very well. And buyers in 25 now are willing to gamble on more distinctive titles and titles that respond to cultural trends. Established distributors such as A24 and Neon and streamers like Netflix and Amazon are showing interest in creative acquisitions, with some leaning towards bigger pre-buys than other completed projects. Documentaries are still facing a tough market out there, relying increasingly on public funding or self-distribution. But ultimately, the industry insiders are stressing this unpredictability of success right now and underscoring the importance of bold and unique storytelling in an oversaturated indie market. What does that mean to you right now? Where do you think we're at taking all that in?
I think we're in the wild, wild west. There are so many rules being created on the fly. It's almost like building the landing gear in flight. For many years, and I don't remember how you felt as you were breaking in, there was sort of this, this desire to stick to tried and true formulas and to sort of follow where the trends were going. And then you'd see a film out, one year all of a sudden there'd be all these westerns or something like that. And one year there'd be all of these high star driven drama pieces and that kind of thing. When I hear everybody saying they're taking risks on all these projects, because it's not like I think that they're actually sitting there going, well, that project will succeed, that project won't, even though they're both risky. I think what it is everybody's trying to find what the next thing is, and nobody wants to be nobody wants to be left out, which is promising. If that's where we're going, I think we're in good shape. It is certainly evident that the money is out there to fund projects. I
Mm.
don't think that's a thing. I think that this is also a backlash to the problems that they're having on the higher end of the box office, where the Marvel movies and all these and all these legacy properties, these intellectual properties that exist out there that are kind of the blockbusters, the things that used to drive the studio's bottom line, are no longer as reliable as they used to be. You can only milk Star Wars so far, right? Like, it seems like some are hits, some are misses, some are great or just not well received. That reliance on these properties to fund you are just not as reliable anymore. And so it opens up a huge opportunity for independent filmmakers to come up with something special and actually find an audience for it. And actually, because I think one of the first things you said, Ken, in that write up from IndieWire, is commercially viable. And that's always going to be the really big sticking point. It's like, how do you define commercially viable? Like, what's commercially viable?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, and we all know this, but there's the Marvel fatigue, the Star Wars fatigue out there. They've been beating these franchises to death, and people are starting to tune out. I mean, look at last year or the year before, 2023. Oppenheimer, made over $1 billion. It's a 3-hour long black and white movie about a nuclear physicist. That on paper, that shouldn't be a success, ultimately.
Where you know the ending.
Well, you know the ending. Yeah, we
Yeah.
know what happened, right? And Barbie, on the flip side, is like the most IP of IP, but done in a really interesting, original way with an indie filmmaker at the helm. And so that was, to me, that kind of started this big trend of just, or it didn't start the trend, but it clarified what people really want, and that is original stories. We're just starting to see those things pop out now. And then with The Substance doing so well, with Thelma, about a 93-year-old woman at a nursing home, action thriller with her, like that's fun and original and small, like, and totally producible, right? But it's
Mhm.
resonating with people. It's just an interesting time, and of course, like, just going back to what you said, I think that there is a lot of money out there, and part of where I'm at in my career, and I think this is like one of the reasons again why we're doing this podcast, is the fact that the Hollywood money that exists today feels like it's kind of locked up for the people that are already established, the A-listers, from the Scorseses to the Bradley Coopers to, that type of thing. And trying to break in right now is really, really difficult. But that doesn't mean that you can't. There's just so much money elsewhere. And it is about finding that money and finding people who are interested in making movies outside of the Hollywood system.
Yeah, and I think you need to the reality check on all of this is that while the money might be out there, it's still run by accountants. It is about the bottom line. Like, they're not looking for this to suddenly serve underrepresented communities because that's a social good. It is because they see profit in it. They see potential profit in it. And they're doing actuarial tables on this stuff and going like, okay, this is where the trends are going. The good and bad about capitalism is that it rarely lies about what it's what the trends are going. Like, that's why insurance companies are usually ahead of the game in terms of what they're predicting the future is going to be. Insurance companies are predicting climate change faster than anybody else is, but they're not going to talk about it publicly, but they're going to do it by their actions. So it's the same thing with Amazon and all these other places in A24. They're looking at what the future holds. Blumhouse did the same thing, right? With its model of making low budget horror films, getting everybody to buy into the idea of interesting and cool ideas. If some of them took off, that was the lottery ticket. If some of them didn't, they still were profitable in that they were made for enough low money that the recoupment wasn't as difficult. So it's important to think like I think that the lesson it gives everybody is that you have to tell the story that you want to tell. Don't try to fit the market, because if you've got a story burning in your brain that you feel needs to be told and you can figure out an interesting way to tell it, and I when I say interesting, don't think commercial, but just think interesting, because if it's interesting, it will be commercial. If it really is interesting. It's not just if it's interesting to your parents, but if it's like interesting to you in a way that you're like, look, like this is a story and you are good at telling through the medium of filming, then there will be an audience for it, and then there might be a commercial viability to it.
As long as you can get it in front of people. I think that's the other, big
Right?
question
Yeah.
mark here, is you can make an amazing film, but if nobody watches it, then what does that get you ultimately? And like, yeah, you made a movie, but I want to make movies so that people watch them. I want as many
Mhm.
people as possible to see my movie, however that
Yeah.
happens, right? So that's the game we're in. The thing about chasing the trends reminds me of this story where I think I heard it on Quentin Tarantino's podcast. And, up until Star Wars, movies generally had one genre. There was the Western, there was the thriller, there was the love story, the crime film. And then Star Wars came around, and Star Wars has multiple genres mixed into that movie, right? It is a Western, a fantasy film, it's science fiction, it's a samurai movie, it's a love story. It has all of these elements in it. And all of a sudden, with its major success, studio heads started to look like, okay, well, we need to put space. We need to incorporate space into all of our films. It was too late to do that with any of the films coming out in 1978. But that's why if you look at the list of films in 1979 that had space involved in the story somehow, the
Mhm.
list is huge. That's how we ended up with James Bond in Moonraker,
With Moonraker. Yep, exactly.
which is the most
Exactly.
batshit crazy James Bond third act I've ever seen, of like all of
Mhm.
these astronauts with lasers just floating in space shooting at each other. And it's
Right.
you have, like, most of the films are stinkers, okay, and most of them are awful, but then you also got Alien that revolutionized science fiction filmmaking basically at
Mhm.
that point.
Well, Alien was science fiction and horror mixed into one, right? Like, so science fiction, suspense, and Hitchcockian thriller all in kind of this one encapsulated film.
To be successful in your storytelling, you need to be able to mix genres. There's this amazing book out there, and I'm sure I'll talk about this a lot in the future too. It's called The Anatomy of Genre by John Truby. I go back to this book
Hmm.
all the time whenever I sit down to write a script because he really clearly lays out what the conventions of each genre are. And I believe there's like 14 key genres, but then there's, thousands of subgenres within that. So from fantasy to science fiction to love story to adventure to, crime and thriller and western and all of these things. And by knowing what the conventions of a genre are, and then taking two genres and combining them together and then seeing how those conventions can fit with each other, now you've created something entirely new. When you play with the subgenres within that, now you have a really cool original story, even though it's familiar and it could be the same plot as Star Wars, frankly. But if it's done in a new genre, now you have something that you've created. It's an interesting thing talking about trends and what to do and where to go with your story, but really it comes down to what's the story you want to tell, but also can you tell that story even if it's familiar, but can you do that in an interesting way?
Yeah, I always say that like there's no, there's that whole Austin Kleon thing of steal like an artist, and like you nobody can make Star Wars again in the way that Star Wars was made because Star Wars did exactly what you're saying. It broke the rules, but also kept it also created a very understandable story that was digestible. Like this is where the commercial potential comes in, right? Like you break all these sort of like, oh, nobody's going to watch a western that takes place in space that's also a love story. Like that seems weird, but then you throw a very digestible, easy story that a 3-year-old can understand.
Yeah.
Because Star Wars, I mean, I saw my vintage will give this will give my vintage away. I saw Star Wars in the movie theater when it first came out. That is the first movie I ever saw in a movie theater,
Oh, amazing.
and I
Okay, I
saw it
didn't know
at its
that.
first
Great.
release. So this will
Yeah.
give you an idea of where I was. And I understood it as much as someone who was just so into sci-fi and comic books, as much as that person would have understood it, I as a 3-year-old understood enough about it to understand what was going on.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the commercial viability comes in, is like, can you distill your story down to the digestible components that allow for an audience to be pulled into the story and go like, oh, I might not understand the space stuff, but I get what's going on.
There's a universal theme aspect to all of this, right? And it's important to keep the universal theme in mind. Like, what's the thing that ties us all together? No matter which background we come from, no matter which country or, ethnicity or culture, or any of that, we're still human beings. We're still living through all of these experiences on a universal level. And if you can tap into that, that's how you maximize your audience. I taught at a film school for a while, for almost 2 years at Vancouver Film School, and students would always ask me like, well, I'm tired of doing something that's been done before. I want to tell like an original story, or asking me, do original stories exist? And I'm like, no, but that's a good thing. We've been around for a long, 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 long time, telling stories for thousands of years. Everything has happened. Tap into that. Find the familiar, but do it in an interesting way, because that is your chance at success, is and resonating with as many people as possible. It's why the same stories continue to be told, but we still love them. Like, look at Dances with Wolves to Pocahontas to Avatar, same story. Star Wars, Luke Skywalker's journey is the same as Harry Potter's journey. Okay, both wildly successful films. And the same thing applies to indie film. You can take those types of that hero's journey, you can create a hero's journey set at a high school. If it follows the same conventional beats, that's good, because audiences want something familiar where they're like, it makes them feel comfortable. But then if you do it in an interesting way and surprise them and subvert their expectations, then you have them on the hook. And that's it's tough to do. You're probably not going to do it right out of the gate, but it takes practice and just working that script.
Oh, 100%. That's what it all comes down to, is, storytelling is not about feeding people information. It's about giving people unique experiences at every turn. And it's that I can't remember you maybe you can help me with this, but your best storytelling technique is to always throw a and then or a but then into every new part of your storyline.
Yeah, it was the South Park guys. It had to be, this happens, but then this happens, but then this happens. And that means that the actions that the character is taking in the story affect the next beat. That if the character
Right.
hadn't done that and hadn't made that choice, that next beat wouldn't exist. And then that's what creates
Hmm.
an interesting through line for your entire plot. What we want to talk about this week is sort of expanding on the topic that we brought up in the first episode about resource filmmaking, or writing to your resources, because we touched on it briefly in the first episode, but really it's kind of the most important thing that you can focus on as an indie filmmaker and getting your movie off the ground. And specifically in those terms, it's about the script. In last week's discussion with the filmmakers of The Stickman's Hollow, Jack talked about how he was always going back to the script when he had doubts about what he was doing. And he talked about how you really have to get the script vetted and in shape because that's where all the other elements come from. And he's 100% right. Now, this is also easy for me to say because for the last 8 years, I've been a professional writer and, like I said, even a film school instructor. So I've seen time and time again how basically it's impossible to make a good movie from a bad script. And you can make it look great and the actors can try their best, but if the story isn't working, the story isn't working. So that's why today we want to talk more about what is hands down the most important part of your film, the script, but also focus on it through the lens of low budget filmmaking and setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, Alfred Hitchcock famously said that to make a great film, you basically need just three things. You need a script, you need the script, and you need the script. When we think about it from an independent filmmaking standpoint, what this really boils down to is understanding that the cheapest thing, like independent filmmakers are always cash poor. We're cash poor in terms of making our production. The cheapest thing you can do is to fix your story and the logistics of your script before you even spend a dime. And that's with pencil and a piece of paper if you really want to get analog. But essentially, your laptop and a screenwriting program are the only things that matter at this stage, and you can do a lot of heavy lifting at this stage to set your film up for success. What we wanted to talk about today was to kind of go through a few key points to consider as independent filmmakers. Can you write your own stories and you also produce them, right? Like when we're talking about independent filmmaking, you're writing them, but you're also the producer on them. Is that correct?
Yeah, generally speaking. The feature that
Yeah.
I'm working on right now, I'm just the director. The writer is my longtime writing partner.
And that brings a good point because even if you're working as a team, so let's say you have a quote head producer, a director, and a writer on an independent film project. Generally speaking, and there are always exceptions to this rule. Generally speaking, all three of them are actually kind of the creative producers on the show. They're all part of the
Yeah,
producing side of things. In other words, they're all making decisions. Whereas in the Hollywood system, the writer writes the script that gets bought, optioned, whatever, and they're brought in to do rewrites based on what the production tells them to do effectively. Whereas in this case,
effectively.
it's
And they're
like
not even, most of the time, invited to set. They're not even anywhere near the production when it's happening.
no, no, exactly. And so, from an independent film standpoint, whether you're a writer, director, or producer, you're going to find yourself producing the film.
Yeah.
So it's important to get that right from the start and to start to think about that. And one of the things you can think about in terms of when you first, let's say you're the writer and you're first getting started, or you want to make a movie. You just say, I want to make a movie. That's my I've always want to make an independent film and I want to make a movie. The first thing I recommend to everybody is you write to the resources at hand. What this means for me is what's the movie you could make in 2 years or less if I started today with everything I have at my disposal. So if I have a rich family member who has $10 million dollars that they're just willing to give me to make a movie, well, that's my resource. Now, most of us don't have that. And if you do, call me. But if we're starting from, we're all quote unquote struggling filmmakers, we'll assume that we're starting from we can't put our own money into a $10 million film in order to make it. So what's the movie you can make in 2 years with what you have in front of you? And as we saw with Stickman's Hollow, and as we talked about in our first episode, good movies can be made for $6,000. So, but the way you do that is you have to start with what you have at your disposal. And you want to start with your available locations. So, what do you have access to? Available cast. Who do you know already? And your budget. So, as an example, let's say I live in an apartment or I live in the basement of a house. Could that be a film set? Do I have access to a warehouse? Is there a park nearby? Does a relative of mine live near a forest? Things like that. Like all these little things. What are the things that you have access to right now? And I would make a list of them, figure out what kind of story could I make with this at hand. And I think about that with cast too. Like when I first started out, I could not have written a script that would have required George Clooney to be in the story in order for it to work. But I had access to a lot of film school actors, people go in film school who are actors, had access to some community people. And then as I worked my way through the TV system and all these other things, you start to meet other actors who are a little more established or a little more experienced, have had a little more time, and may even have a little bit more recognition out there. And you start to build from there. But when you're making your first short film, you're using the best actors available to you at the time. And this is not actually at all taking away from it because a lot of the ones I worked with have become actors in the film industry out here. So
Yeah.
at the time though, they were students. So start with that. That would be the first thing I would aim for, and I would say that your story starts with what you have.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I go back to this all the time. Whenever we're coming up with a new project, thinking about what to do, that's where we start. Where can we shoot? Who do we have available? What's sort of the easiest path to success in some ways here? As far as like my own films and how I've implemented this in the past, I made a short horror film a few years ago called Luto, and it was just me and my camera equipment, and it was the day after Christmas. My girlfriend and I were at home in our apartment, and we're like, hey, why don't we shoot a horror movie? And this is sort of at the beginning of my directing journey. So we shot this thing in a day and just used the apartment, the equipment that I had here at home. I shot it on Panasonic GH5S. I thought it turned out like really, really well. I did everything. And also at the same time, I learned how to do the visual effects for the film. So there are a number of visual effects shots in the movie that I taught myself how to do using After Effects and Blender. And if you're not sure about that, go on YouTube. There's a tutorial for literally everything on YouTube. So if you're ever unsure about how to use a certain software, how to sound mix your movie, anything, it's on YouTube.
Yep.
And so I
The
made
only
the first.
investment you have is time.
Exactly. Yeah. So I made the first movie, and a year later, my girlfriend's dad was coming from Brazil to visit us, and he made an appearance in that very first film, just as a voiceover. And I was thinking, I was like, oh, it'd be fun to do a sequel to that short, and we'll do it the exact same way. So it was just me, a camera, and my girlfriend's father. He's from Brazil. He doesn't speak any English. He has never acted a day in his life. He's 78 years old at the time. It was just the two of us and a camera, and I had to direct him using Google Translate. But we made this movie, and I was trying to think, like, how can I make this movie a little bit bigger and expand? Like, what resources do I have to make this happen? But I realized that with my camera and my gimbal, which is basically like a poor man's Steadicam, I kind of looked like a tourist walking around with this thing. And so we just shot all over the place. I took them downtown. We shot on the C bus. We shot in the C bus terminal. And the movie now all of a sudden had this like way bigger scope because I was totally breaking the rules. Like nobody knew I was shooting there, but I looked like a tourist. I had such a small footprint as this like little indie filmmaker. That's another resource that I was like, okay, I think I can make this work. But if I had a big crew, obviously it wouldn't have worked out that way. So it worked
Yeah.
for my situation.
Right. And if you had a movie that required a big crew, like if you need to have that kind of stuff, then yeah, you're not going to be able to do exactly what you just said, which is get out there and we don't want to shoot guerrilla because we want to make sure that we don't break the rules. Nobody ever said you couldn't go out there with a DSLR and film people. Like there's so many.
You're doing it all the time. You walk through
Everybody's doing
Gastown,
it all the time.
everybody has a camera shooting everything. So,
Yeah.
just go for it. Obviously, you want to be respectful, you don't want to get in people's way, and you don't want to cause any problems, but it was just the two of us and a camera, and it was in the middle of the day where the C bus was empty, so I could get multiple takes, and it worked out. And the rest of the movie all took place in the apartment anyway, but I just needed one scene where it was out in the world.
That's fantastic. That's a really good example, and also just I like what you said about the visual effects in the blender too, because this doesn't have to limit your scope of what you're looking for in making your film. Like if you can get on there and learn After Effects in a month or something and just dig into Blender, After Effects, and nowadays, I mean Unreal Engine or whatever, and make yourself at least competent in that to the point of being able to achieve something that might not be achievable elsewhere. I mean, you can take what would be a very low budget film and make it look you can make your story look you filmed in Vancouver, but you could make it look like it was filmed on an alien planet if you wanted to.
Well, here's the
There's
really interesting thing about that is the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once that won the Oscar a couple of years ago. There were 800 visual effects shots in that movie, and there were only 6 visual effects artists on that film, and 2 of them were the directors because the
right.
Daniels, their background is in visual effects because in doing music videos for like almost no money at all, they had to get super resourceful and figure out how to do all of these things in post themselves because there just wasn't money to hire a visual effects house to handle all of their work. So Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I believe at the time they were saying the movie was around $14 million, but I think it actually was more in the 20 to 30 range overall. All of the visual effects were done by just a group of guys, group of friends, ultimately, that had been working together for a long time using free software. Blender is entirely
Mhm.
free. After Effects is a subscription. If they can do it, so can you, 100%.
Exactly.
And The other
100%.
reason why it's really good to learn these little tricks, and again, you don't have to become a master at any of these skills, but knowing just a little bit will help you down the road, especially when a visual effects company is saying, like, this is going to cost $10,000. And you're like, no, I can do that myself in 45 minutes in After Effects. You want me to pay $5,000 to paint out these wires? No, I'll do that myself. On Annabelle Creation, David Sandberg, who
David Sandberg, yep.
a great director, writer, who did the Lights Out short film that went viral and has done a whole bunch of short films, but then Lights Out went viral, and that got him his first feature film directing job, Lights Out, written by Eric Heiserer, who wrote Arrival. After that, David did this film in the Annabelle series called Annabelle Creation. Even with the studio behind them, there were still moments where he needed some extra shots, and he knew how to do that himself in Blender using, high resolution images, virtual cameras, that type of thing. He has a YouTube video about it, and it's so interesting that you think this, like, Hollywood film, a Blumhouse film. Sure, it's a small budget movie, but it's going to theaters. It is a Hollywood movie, and has a distributor and everything. It's Universal Studios. Even David Sandberg was just like on his MacBook doing some extra shots. Knowing these things is going to get you so much further. It's a very, very interesting thing. And again, it's just time right now. It's the software is basically free. You just need some extra time. There are tutorials on YouTube.
And that's what, and we sometimes limit our thinking of what resource filmmaking means to, oh, I've got a location, or I own a cool car that I can use in the film or whatever. And that's really, your ultimate secret weapon is, what do you have the time to go and learn yourself? Like, save money by becoming at least 60 to 80% competent in certain areas. Because if you don't have to do something as simple as remove a pedestrian from the background because you shot in a live environment and you didn't get their permission to film and they wandered into frame or whatever it is, if you can just do that, if you can paint out a person in the background and learn how to do that yourself, you think about what that can cascade to in terms of your budget for making a film. Because then you also don't have to think to yourself, oh, I have to do a take again because we didn't lock up the road properly. No, you just go, you shoot it, you get your take, you get out of there, and you go, okay, yeah, I'll remove the person in post. I mean, I know it's a fix it in post thing, but it's like, I know we can do it because I know how to do it. And the funny part is that directors, even like the really good directors, use this process throughout. Yeah, like, they're given bigger toys, they're given bigger pieces to work with. But in the end, they have to know that they can achieve it. They have to know
Yeah.
that this is actually possible. Like, they have to sit there and go, other than James Cameron convincing people to invent the technology that he needed for Avatar, most directors, even in the Hollywood system, are asked, like, how would you achieve this? And that's the thing. Like, they're coming at it from a background of, I know we can do this because this is what exists out there now that we can put this together with. And as an indie filmmaker, I mean, you have to think that way. You have to back into the script. You go, I'm not going to write something that can't be done, that I can't see myself being able to do.
Yeah.
And that's the main point, is like, if you know visual effects, Blender, if you have a good background, or even if you're like, look, I can take 6 months to learn this while I'm writing my script, you can spend the time doing that. Well, then write it into your script. Write a spaceship into your script. You can do that if you're able to. But if you have no idea how to do it and you don't even know where to start, don't start with a spaceship.
I still have high standards. Like, I'm not going to write a Benjamin Button story because I know that I just can't achieve that. And if I tried to do that with makeup, or if I tried to do that with visual effects, it just wouldn't turn out to be as good. So just respect what the limitations are, but play within that sandbox. And again, the resources are there. You can buy a green screen on Amazon for like $20. Find an old car door or something like that, put it in front. Now all of a sudden you can do a driving shot if that's what you need for your movie, and you could do it in your bedroom.
Yeah, you want to demonstrate competency in the art of making the film, and sometimes by adding pieces that you can't achieve, you actually are going to reveal more about what you can't accomplish rather than what you can. Because if people just look at your film and go, "Oh, that's just a low budget version of Star Wars," or "That's just a low budget version of this," that's not what you're going for. Like, that's not what you want. You don't want people sitting there going, "That was pretty good for $3,000." The budget should not be the thing that people are talking about when they leave the theater. And that, I know it becomes a story sometimes about how these films got achieved, but that's after the fact. Like, the filmmaker would have taken 10,000, 20,000, $100,000 to make the film if they could have.
The other thing too, I just want to like kind of take a step back from, the things you can do or like the technology around it, is that you can make it look as good as possible. I mean, ARRI Alexas are available. There are a lot of people that have them out there right now, and so your film can
Mhm.
look like a Hollywood level film. Totally. That's easy. If the story and the characters aren't interesting or engaging or resonate with people, then you're dead in the water. So I just
Mhm.
want to talk about character a little bit because that's where what it all starts with. I come from the Aaron Sorkin school of thought where I don't write crazy backstories for my characters. I don't know where they grew up typically. I don't know where they went to school. I don't really know too much about their family life unless any of those points are important to the story itself. So when I'm thinking about character, I also am thinking about theme and what is the thing that I'm trying to say with my movie. And character and theme to me are locked together. Character is a representation of theme, and ultimately your movie should be saying something. If your movie is just a bunch of cool shots and you just think that it's neat or whatever, you're not going to get very far. You want to be saying something with your film. So when it comes to character, the way I approach creating a character is first thinking about these three elements. What does a character want? What's the obstacle standing in their way of getting what they want? And what tactic are they going to use to get what they want? So, for example, Anthony has $20. I want $20. Anthony is my obstacle. What tactic am I going to use to get the $20 from Anthony? Am I going to lie to you? Am I going to fight you? Am I going to steal from you? What tactic I use is going to determine exactly what type of character I am. Another example of thinking about character is this burning car scenario that I read about, which is basically like one of the world's best neurosurgeons is driving in his Porsche down this dark highway late at night. It's pouring rain. And this is a guy who has multiple homes around the world, staff working for him at these homes. And he rounds the corner in his Porsche and he's approaching this tunnel. And in the tunnel, he can see a car that's upside down on fire. And he sees that there's a person inside. What does he do, right? He gets out of the car, and as he's stepping forward, he sees that the person inside is his housekeeper. Now, this is a person that he deems far less important than he deems himself in this world. His next choice determines what type of character he is. Does he risk his hands, his entire career and profession, to save this person out of, from this burning car, or does he stand back and let her die? And whatever he does, if he makes a courageous move or if he makes a cowardly move, that's going to determine what type of character this guy is. So character isn't so much about the backstory. Oh, he went to Yale and he comes from this family and he lives in Connecticut and he likes, as Aaron Sorkin would say, like smooth peanut butter versus chunky peanut butter. No, that doesn't mean anything. Character is what choices do they make? What tactic do they use to advance the story? So when you're struggling with plot and coming up with an idea for scenes or where the story should go, ask yourself, what does your character want? And what's an obstacle that you can put in their way to make them make a choice? Luke Skywalker wants to be a pilot. He wants to get off of Tatooine and become an amazing pilot. That's what he wants. And
Mhm.
the obstacle that's in his way ultimately is working with his uncle and aunt and never being able to get off this planet. But then he comes across the message from Princess Leia to find Obi-Wan Kenobi, and that sets him on his journey. And so by the end of the movie, he becomes this amazing pilot that launches the torpedo and destroys the Death Star.
Spoiler.
Oh yeah, spoiler alert. Yeah, exactly. That's one way to approach it. If you're ever feeling stuck, it's really just focus on character.
I would agree 100%. I think the difference between a novel and a movie, in a novel, we hear the internal thoughts of our character. In a movie, we have to see those thoughts actualized. And a
Yeah.
great example from that, and again, this is in the blockbuster realm, but it's useful in the independent film realm, is the difference in the parkour chase between James Bond and Daniel Craig's James Bond and the parkour guy
Yeah.
in
Great,
the
great
parkour
sequence.
terrorist, right? Great sequence. But you know what? It's exciting, it's interesting, it's everything like that. But ultimately, in the end, when you dissect it down to what it is, this parkour guy has all of these great moves and talent that James Bond does not have. This guy can get away from James Bond by climbing, by jumping, by doing all of these parkour training tips. James Bond runs through the wall.
Yeah.
James Bond uses because he's a blunt instrument, and that's actually how they describe him throughout that first film. He's a blunt instrument,
Yeah, the guy goes like jumps like elegantly through the hole and James Bond just like
and
goes through the wall.
runs through,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
that tells you everything you need to know about the about where James Bond is at this stage in his career journey, because that's the whole premise of the film is setting up the idea that James Bond hasn't yet become the refined secret agent that we
Yeah.
know of know him because it's an origin story.
The other thing to think about too, if you're ever getting stuck with story, the number one note you're going to get is we got to raise the stakes. There needs to be more conflict. I think conflict, I don't like using the word conflict anymore. I think it's a subjective term because, like, what is conflict, right? Like, oh, he's angry. Well, what does angry mean? Is that just a look, or is he getting ready to fight? Instead of using conflict, I like to use the word choice. And one way to raise the stakes always is to make your character make a tough choice. When it comes to the 3 act structure, and that's something, that would be a pretty long discussion, but at the end of the first act, there's this thing called the inciting incident for those that aren't aware. And the inciting incident is basically the part where your character sets out into a new world. Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru have just been killed. Luke has a choice now. Do I stay on Tatooine and be killed by the stormtroopers and the Empire, or do I go with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Han Solo to save the princess? And that is a choice that he has to make. He can stay behind and get killed, but he chooses to go into this brand new world and start his journey with Obi-Wan Kenobi. In Barbie, to use Barbie as an example, Barbie has to make a choice as well at the end of the first act. Does she stay here and deal with having cellulite and not knowing what's going on with these visions that she's having? No, she's going to solve this problem and she's going to go into the real world. This is something to really keep in mind as far as trying to make things really tough for your character. Give them a choice to make, right? Don't just think about conflict, but give them a choice to make. And then that choice leads to action, and that action is served by tactic.
Like, the best choices are 2 bad choices. Frodo can stay at the Shire and just accept that the threats of the world may come, but and just hope that it never comes to the Shire, but still live a normal life.
Yeah.
Or can take the charge of what's been given to him and go out into the unknown and take a step and kinda and get into the unfamiliar and risk everything for something that is greater without having any knowledge. So there is a choice there, but it's a the choice to stay home is still a choice, and it could be there. It's not a forced he doesn't have to leave.
These examples are from successful Hollywood movies, but we use them as examples because they're easy touchstones that most of us know, but they apply to your indie story and the smallest story of all.
But if you think of, like, My Dinner with Andre or anything like that, like there's choices in what topics to discuss, in how to respond to the choice across the table. Like, how are we going to get through this conversation, and how is this conversation gonna play out in a way where we're gonna learn more about these characters without them telling us about who they are. We learn about them through what they talk about, and we're interested because they're giving us rich things to consider and forcing the audience to choose who do I wanna whose opinion do I care about more? And realizing that it's not all binary. And so sometimes it's a choice that the characters are making, but they're imposing that choice on the audience. Like, you pick a side and realize that you can't just pick a side.
Yeah, and there are some great just dialogue heavy movies that come to mind. I mean, so like the Before Sunset series, Before Sunset, all
Mhm.
of that's great. My Dinner with Andre. I watched one recently called The Outfit with Mark Rylance. It's all
Oh,
set
that's
in this,
fantastic.
yeah, in this, British tailor's shop,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and it's all just dialogue, but what is revealed and how characters respond to what is revealed in the dialogue, those are choices that they're making. Do they tell the truth? Do they lie? How do they handle the situation? And so again, if your movie is just set in one room, you're
Very
not limited
contained.
at all by character. You're limited
No.
by space and the resources that you have in terms of props and set deck, but that actually doesn't limit your story in any way.
The Outfit is a fantastic example, and I remember when we watched that film, just thinking, I could have made this. Like,
Yeah.
this is totally within the scope of an independent film in terms of just the logistics of putting this together. But it goes to your point. What makes that film so good is that the characters. First of all, the characters are all fantastic, but they're fantastic not because they're quirky, but because they all have motivations to what they're doing, and
Yeah.
all of those weave into each other. Like, they're necessary in order to move the story along, and the story is moved along to the point where you're just sitting there, like, waiting to see what happens next, and waiting to see
Yeah.
who's backstabbing who and everything else. That could have been made for $6,000 if you wanted it to. If you had access to a tailor shop, you knew some decent actors in town, could have made that same story. I always say writing is like the best production value you can bring to the film is in how you write a story and what you tell in the story. And it comes down to this idea, I think you said this earlier, that if you don't start with the strong characters and strong story and a strong way of telling it, then it's not going to get better throughout production. Like once you have to start here, and a bad script doesn't get better when we start filming it. And I think that what you're talking about too is just sort of taking a look and going, okay, so how do I, like, The Outfit is a great example of a movie that is riveting, thrilling, but it's kind of subverting that genre a bit. It's taking that genre and flipping it around, kit bashing it together with other ideas. Like, what about having a zombie musical? And what about having taking two seemingly disparate genres and smashing them together and subverting expectations, but also taking the expectations of the genre and delivering those in a very unique way. So what do you do if you're making a horror film? There's an expectation with horror films that people are going to be scared. So you have to scare people,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
If you're
it's how
playing
you
with genre, you really do have to stick to the conventions of the genre because if you don't, the audience can feel that something isn't right. Using the conventions that have been around for a long time is not a bad thing. It allows the audience
no.
to anticipate something, but then it's your job to subvert that expectation and do it in a very interesting way. So by combining genres and finding something new and then doing it with your own voice, nobody is telling this story other than you, right? Because it's your idea in how this is going to be executed. So it's original in that way. By focusing on that, by maintaining the conventions of the genre, you're going to have success in your storytelling. And it's very important to be hard on yourself about the story. Like just because you've written a script, the first draft is the vomit draft as we call it, right? The first draft is going to the quarry and digging in the ground and grabbing a lump of clay and putting that clay on the wheel. Okay, that's the first draft. It is still a lump of clay on the wheel. The subsequent drafts are turning that clay into a beautiful vase. And it may take a long time, right? But just because you've written the script doesn't mean that it's ready to shoot. Really work it. Find a network of writers or actors around you to read it and give you honest feedback. If everybody's telling you that they loved it, but they can't really name anything specific about it, like find the people who hate it, right? Find somebody. I have one friend, Jay, if you're listening, it's you. And I always send him my scripts because he hates everything. We're very, very good friends, but he has a way different taste than I do. And so I want to know what he thinks of it because I can send it to people who are going to tell me that my writing is good. Maybe they're just being nice. But I also want to send it to people who maybe aren't going to like the script and then kind of sift through their notes and be like, okay, this is actually working. My intention was this, and I think it's working, but they bumped on this part of the script. Okay, cool. Find that core group of trusted readers to help you get your work to where it needs to be. The script doesn't get better during production. We're just trying to save it at that point. And it's going to evolve. And like we've talked about, you write the story 3 times, but you really just want to have the best material for day one of production.
I can't agree more. There are so many times where scripts are just rushed to production because they finally got the actor they wanted to play, and they want to make sure they get it done within the year because the actor's available but might not be available. And you rush a story that isn't ready. You set yourself up for quite a lot of heartbreak because you wind up realizing the flaws while you're filming it. And sometimes it gets revealed in the most awkward of circumstances. I have been on sets where you just look around at all and you just can see the wide-eyedness of a director or of an actor realizing that the story doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
And it took until that moment for it to, all of a sudden they're like, "Wait, why did I do this? I don't
Yeah.
understand." But it's because we're so rushed that we're not even paying attention to those little details that are pulling us there. And this isn't just about the mechanics of like, how did I get from the car to the house or anything like that. It's just more like, why did I make that decision when I've already made that decision? I think you've said it really well. Is you've got to get out of your head on this, because the vomit draft is where you throw all the cliches. That's the one that you kind of never show to anybody, because you look at it and you go, okay, well, this has given me the bones of my story, and then you do that, but then you have to take that and now you have to now sift it and go, okay, as you were saying, you have to refine this into what is this sculpture going to be. I picked the clay because I wanted to make a sculpture of a very specific type, and as you start to carve it out, you start to look at photos of David and you start to look at photos of other sculptures and you start to mimic those things. And of course, your sculpture starts to look a little bit more like that. And now what you have to do is you now have to make it one true story. So your character,
Yeah.
all your characters have to have distinct voices to them. And we often say, I don't know how you feel about this, but I always say, if you can't tell one voice from another, then probably one of the characters is unnecessary.
Yeah.
Like if you
Yeah.
can't, if two characters are acting the same way and neither of them have any difference in how they react to a situation, and they all have the same dialogue and whatever, one of them is not necessary in this story. And you start to
Yeah. Or
carve those
combine them.
parts of them.
Yeah.
And I think a script is a series of setups and payoffs. Whatever you put in there at the beginning somehow has to pay off at some point. If a character is introduced, they have to have a value in the story that is set up at the beginning of the story.
As Billy Wilder said, if there's a problem with your ending, it's because you have a problem with your beginning, right? If there's a
Hmm.
problem in your third act, it's because there's a problem in your first act.
I think to say like these are sort of the common indie filmmaking mistakes that we've seen or I've seen when I'm reading screenplays is we overstuff the script, keep it simple, find a single strong premise and excel at that single strong premise. Don't ignore audience clarity. Like it's good to give audiences ambiguity, but don't confuse them. When we talk about being unique and subversive and giving them things they aren't expecting, you don't want to confuse them and you don't want to make them question the logic of the film. So vagueness is not depth.
Yeah.
You can't sit there and say this is a thinking person's film, right? Like this is a thinking person. You got to really think about it, and then you need the director to be there for the Q&A in order to understand what the director was going for.
Yeah. Give us an ending, please.
It can be a cool ending that isn't the ending we expected or that we think we want. Just give us something that does give us an ending to the film.
Yeah, the amount of short films that I've seen that have an open ending and then the filmmaker's like, "Oh, but it's up for interpretation." Bullshit. Give me an
No,
ending. I
yeah,
want a full
it,
story. I don't want it to seem like I just sat down and ate half a meal and I'm unsatisfied.
if that's what I wanted, I if I watch a rom-com, they kiss at the end. My assumption is that they go off and life lives happily ever after. But I also know that 50% of marriages end in divorce and blah 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 blah. And it's like
Yeah.
I don't. It's like I don't. I just need the ending that says that they got together in the end, or if they didn't get together, there was a really cool reason why, and we didn't, and we just let it go from there. And that's the ending of the rom-com. Like that's my expectation is that if I'm going to see a romantic comedy, that's what I'm getting at the end. And you're either giving it to me if you give it to me in the cliched same way that I've seen it all the time, it'll be boring. But if you give it to me in a unique way, I will be excited. And if you don't give it to me, but you give me something else that's an ending still, good for you. You've done what you need to do. So then, obviously we talked about this before: cliches and predictable characters. If you're going to give us the same cliche, you've got to subvert it somehow.
Yeah.
One-dimensional bad guys don't work anymore. I think that trope has been. You can't just have the evil person anymore. The evil person needs to have a reason to exist.
Well, the villain needs to be written like the protagonist in that they have wants and needs and obstacles and tactics as well. And one way to look at it is if the villain or your antagonist died and went to heaven and he's at the pearly gates and he has to make a case for why he should get in, they're going to believe that they did a good thing. That what they were like Thanos, I think it was a great villain talking about like mainstream. Thanos wanted to destroy half of the universe, but you're kind of like, well, overpopulation is a problem. Like he's
Yeah, I
kind of
get
onto something.
it.
Like I get it.
Yeah.
And he believed he was doing the right thing. So
Uh,
that's a trick to writing your villain.
and his method was very egalitarian. It was indiscriminate. He didn't pick favorites. He didn't say I'm going to save the rich and get rid of the
Yeah.
poor. He didn't discriminate. I mean, in a weird way, you go, well, that's a heroic action. He's done if he's
In his
following his
mind, he is a
own in
hero.
his own
Absolutely.
journey, he's a hero.
Yeah.
And it's totally justifiable in if you watch the character and so on. You remember these people because they were written so well and they were written with some depth and some thought went into how they were constructed. Generic bad guy number one with henchman number one
Yeah.
is not memorable. You don't remember who they are. And I'm thinking of this in sort of like that, evil versus good side of things, but even just in the simplest dramas, you remember characters because characters who are memorable make you stand out and remember the film, and sometimes they stand out in the best ways possible. Avoid the traps of too indie. Like we always say, like you don't need to be again too abstract, too indulgent, too slow. You have to make something that is for you, but also think to yourself, like I can't. I'm not gonna write out the story of my childhood because my childhood is only interesting to me. Now, what I could do is take a story from my childhood and expand it into a larger story and create an actual narrative around that that might be based around a particular moment that happened in my story.
Yeah.
But I don't think people want to see the Anthony Epp story on screen.
Maybe one day. Maybe one day.
Maybe one day. How do you feel about kind of these? I'm sort of getting through some of these, but it's
Well, it comes down to character. If the Anthony Epps story is a really interesting character, then it could be that could be the movie. Like here's the thing, my latest short film, The Doukhobor, is a horror drama that is produced by the Directors Guild of Canada, and we had a lot of money to make this movie. I won a grant. I'm part of the Directors Guild Emerging Greenlight, and we had a chance to make this movie. It's a period piece set in 1959 in southern British Columbia. It's a story that I've grown up with. It's about my family, okay, about my family history. And it's a history that almost no one in this country knows, let alone the rest of the world, where the British Columbia government interned over 200 Freedomite Doukhobor children in a residential school in southern BC in the 1950s. And my aunts and uncles were taken from their homes and held in this residential school away from their families, stripped of their humanity, their culture, their parents for 6 years. It's a story that I've wanted to tell my entire life. And we found a great way into it by turning it into a horror allegory and very much a monster movie about there's a monster in the woods taking children away. And that was our way in. So maybe you do have a very interesting family history or a relationship with your parents or something that just happened to you as a child. There could be a really great way to tell that story that isn't necessarily the biopic of who you are. And so think about what you bring to the table, what you know, what your lived experience is, because often that authenticity is going to make it that much stronger.
that's a really good way to reframe it. In that what you want to do is take your story and make it relatable to others. Like that horror allegory that you put in there draws people in because people have come to see that. And then once you tie it to the theme, you go, oh yeah, you know what? I see what we're getting here. I see, it's almost like you're stuffing the medicine into the candy.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
you're giving people something like a movie is a story. Our life has events in it, and each part of that could become a story if you learn how to tell it properly. And that's what directors and screenwriters are supposed to do. Is they're supposed to learn how to tell stories effectively. Like you and I can tell the same story. Both of us are going to take it from our perspective. And if you're a better storyteller, your story will resonate more with an audience than my story will if I'm not capable of telling that story properly.
Well, and the thing about my movie is that I knew that most people would not want to watch a 1950s period piece about a bunch of Russians in southern British Columbia. So I had to take that and figure out a way to make that most accessible to, the largest audience possible. How do I do that? I'm going to turn it into a monster movie. You don't even know what it's really about until the very end, where I tell you, oh, hey, by the
Right.
way, the monster in this movie is the BC government, and here's the pictures, and here's the real history of what happened. And that's a
Yep.
shocking moment for a lot of people who are going to realize that this, if you're in Canada, this happened in your backyard and you had no idea.
Yeah.
And it plays differently for certain audiences. I've played it for my Doukhobor family, and the entire room, everybody's in tears, and in other crowds, people just love the technical aspect or whatever. I mean, the movie looks great. We had an amazing crew, and I had to figure out how to tell that very personal, specific story in the broadest terms possible.
You're trying to have the audience feel what it's like to have to be in that situation in a very unique way. And it's a short film, so you don't have a lot of time to get there. So you have to give the audience some pieces to bring them along on the journey with you. Get them to
Yeah.
buy into wanting to be on this journey with you. If you you have to show you have to give them that horror monstery sort of piece in order for us to all get it and all to get on that train with you because we want to see where you're going to take us with it. And again, this doesn't, that you've got a very beautiful short horror film that explains a very good message and also it teaches people something about some history, but also is just it's a film that you're on the edge of your seat to experience, which is the point of the movie and which is the point of movies in the first place. The point is to feel something, not necessarily to intellectualize the experience to the point where you have to dissect every little piece. It's like, no, I just want to feel this. And in the end, you go, oh, I got to feel the way that the main character feels.
The other thing to keep in mind about filmmaking and how we talked about, like, if you're just doing something because it's cool, it's probably not going to just resonate with people very much. As a filmmaker, as a director, the three questions that you're going to receive when you are pitching this movie to whether it's investors, producers, executives, anybody, you're just telling people about this movie. Why this story? are you telling this story now? And why are you telling this story? Right? So you have to have answers to all three of these questions. And so
Mhm.
with my latest film, The Doukhobor, well, this is a story I've been wanting to tell for a long time. It's about my family. It's a story that nobody knows. The BC government just apologized formally to my family and to the Doukhobor people. So it's a very timely story. All of these factors played into that. And with my next project, as a director, I have to be able to talk about why I'm the one that should be telling the story and what it's really about. Because the way in is through theme and through character and what I bring to the table and what this is actually about. Not the plot, but what's the theme and what's it actually about. And when you can pitch that properly and form that connection with whoever's listening to be like, don't you feel that way too about life or about relationships, about friendships, about whatever's going on? They go, yeah, I do feel that way. It's like, well, that's at the core of this movie. That's at the heart of this movie, and that's what's really going on with these characters. But it's actually couched in a fun horror romp in a small town. That's something to always be thinking about as you're crafting this story. Why are you the one telling this story, and what do you bring to the table as a director, as a writer, as a filmmaker to elevate this story and have it resonate with people around the world?
Ultimately, in the end, that's kind of, I mean, for lack of a better saying it, that's the marketing of the film. Is you Ken, or me, Anthony, making the film that I want to make. Why am I the one wanting to make this film? And for pure survival purposes, you have to live with this thing for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years of your life. You need a lot of belief in the
You need to
project and
fall in
in
love with it.
yourself. You have to be so in love with this that when it breaks your heart, you keep fighting for it, which is easy to say right now. It's easy to say, "Oh, well, of course," but there are many times with my first feature film and with this one where you just kind of go like, I don't even know what the story is anymore. I don't even know why I'm doing this anymore. And in a moment, you have to have something that can trigger you back to go like, no, like I now let me ground myself in why I wanted to be here in the first place. It was a thing where it's like, now I owe it to myself to finish this because I believed in this at the beginning. These are the reasons I wanted to be the person who is behind the helm of making this thing happen, and why it couldn't have been anybody else, because nobody else would have given their heart and soul to make this happen. Nobody else would have put the hours, the time, and the emotional energy into making this work. If you don't set yourself up for success from the get-go by having this hunger inside you that only you can make this film, then it won't last. You'll burn out far too soon.
Totally. I completely agree. But that's why we're here. That's why we do these things.
That's
I
why we're
can't
here.
imagine doing anything else.
No, we exactly, that's the thing. We've essentially burned the boats and said that there's no going back, and it's the life you chose. You're in it to win it, or you're in it to die trying, I guess.
Obviously, we've been talking about this for a long time and we can keep going for hours and hours and hours, but we are sort of coming to the end here. And we also want to hear from you. If you have anything to add to this discussion or questions or clarification on anything, email us, comment in the comment section on the podcast link. We want to hear from you. And so we find this super exciting, and we hope that some of these tools resonate with you as far as moving forward with your projects. But it is time now to do the thing that we do every week, which is give a shout out to some indie crowdfunding campaigns that got our attention. And so my pick this week is Caffeine Dependency, which is a short film that explores the concept of codependency in relationships. And the filmmakers want to offer a commentary on how this dynamic can affect couples, especially those struggling with a sense of self. They want audiences to connect with the root of their story, which is learning how to love. Now, I'm not going to lie, I was first drawn to this because I may in fact be addicted to coffee, but after reading more about what the filmmakers Jesse and Stella were up to, I was really drawn to their project. This is a simple story with a great universal theme that so many couples can relate to. They're only looking for $1,000 to make this movie, and as of this recording, they've already raised $275, so they're almost there. Their campaign info is in our show notes, and best of luck to the team. How about you, Anthony?
All right, so my pick this week is the Mahal Empire, and this is a little bit off the grid. This is an indie filmmaking powerhouse. They've raised over $3 million in crowdfunding for their projects. Now, not one project, but they typically raise anywhere from 200 to $300,000 per film, and they make their films at these sort of low budget indie levels. They make horror and sci-fi and adventure films. They've got a pirate film up there. and they make them for roughly between $300 and $500,000. So in that very indie space, but they raise all their funding through crowdfunding and sponsorships. So their campaigns, the reason I think their campaigns work, and I was looking at a few of them, is because they deliver every time, first of all. So one of the things with crowdfunding is you've got to, if you're going to become successful at crowdfunding, there's two ways that filmmakers look at it. They look at it either as a one-off, they do it once and then they never do it again, or they build traction through their crowdfunding and and people just expect, oh, these guys are always, their next film, they're going to throw up a campaign. And Jim Cummings does that with his films.
Yeah.
We'll probably talk about him in the future, but you
It's
know,
about building a
all
community,
these
right? Yeah.
building a community, and they build that through crowdfunding. Like, they use the crowdfunding as a community building exercise. So they give their backers inside content updates that nobody else sees. They give them behind the scenes content, and they have these sort of wild over the top concepts. So their concepts stand out. Like, they do sci-fi, horror, and things like that. They very much lean into that niche, and they kind of embrace this campy practical effects and unapologetic storytelling, and they've built an audience around it, and their audience just comes back and supports them all the time. They're not the audience doesn't support because they're getting anything out of it other than digital posters and getting to watch the movie.
Cool.
So they have a latest film called Alien Horde, and it's currently raising finishing funds. And it's another one of these sort of crowd pleasing rides. An interesting learning tool from there is it's not just about funding a film, it's about creating and joining a movement. So when you're putting these crowdfunding campaigns together, don't just think of it as like, oh, I'm going to do everything I can to get the money for this film and then whatever. You've got to create a movement around it. You've got to keep your audience engaged. The people that have funded your film, they need to hear from you. And even if it's just simple updates, most people love to be part of the conversation. If you're not in the film industry, a lot of people just like to hear about it, right? Like I
Yeah.
always think to myself that the conversations that you and I are having, even when we're out at coffee or something, other people around us would love to be part of that conversation. And that isn't to brag that we've got the best job in the world, but the stuff we're talking about is really fun. We'll put their link in the show notes to their latest film, and you can check them out. I would say this is a very good place to go if you want to learn about how to crowdfund genre type films and how to do it effectively.
That's really cool. That's great to know. Yeah. Okay, so that's it for this week's episode of Off the Lot. We want to hear from you. If there are any topics you want covered or any questions that you would like answered, please email us at podcast.offthelot@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. Our handles are in the show notes. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe, and we will see you next week. See you, Anthony.
Have a great week, Ken.